Well, good morning and Shabbat Shalom. I'm Rabbi Ed Feinstein. This is Valley Beth Shalom Torah study for a Shabbos morning. And I'm joined this morning by my dear friend and teacher, Rabbi Marc Gellman from South Florida. Thank you, Marc. And our colleague, Sherry Hirsch, is spending the Shabbos with her family. So we wish Sherry all of our blessings. Hope you're having a very good week. This morning, we open up to the most challenging Torah portion of all, the most remarkable stories. We're in the middle of the stories of Avraham, of Abraham. And of course, Abraham is the first Jew. He's the archetype of the Jewish people. He is Avraham Avinu. He is our progenitor. He's our father. He's the beginner. He carries in him the entire experience and pathos of the Jewish people. And this morning, we have two stories of Abraham. The story begins when three angels, or three people actually, that he discovers later are angels, appear at his tent. The first announces that he's going to be a father and Sarah is going to be a mother. That causes her to laugh. And then the second two take us into the story of Sodom and Gomorrah. And the Torah portion winds up with the chilling story of Akedat Yitzchak, the binding, the near sacrifice of Isaac. It's a remarkable story. Now let's just step back for just a moment and gather in where we've come from. Seems to me that the book of Genesis is a drama in three acts. We're introduced on the very first page to the principal actor, who is God. And what do we know about God? We don't know where God comes from. We don't know what God is made of. We don't know any of the metaphysics of God. What we do know is that this is a God who creates and a God who dreams and a God who creates a partner, a human being created in the divine image to share the responsibility for caring for the world and for carrying forward the divine dream of a world of oneness, a world of peace, a world of wholeness, a world of life. But the human being disappoints God. And at the end of our first chapter, which is the end of the first Torah portion, Breshit, the human being has so disappointed God that God decides he's going to destroy it all. Just destroy it all. It was a bad experiment in creation. And just before he destroys it all, his eye catches one human being named Noah. And God decides this man has moral potential. He could be a partner. I couldn't create a human being to be a partner. Perhaps I can choose this one. And he starts again with Noah, wipes the world clean, begins again with Noah. But here too, human beings disappoint God. And by the end of that story, the world is once again in a terrible place. But this time, God has promised not to destroy it all. So he's in a bind, as it were. He's stuck. I couldn't create a human being to be my partner. I couldn't choose one to be my partner. Perhaps I can teach one. And so he approaches this man, Avraham. And there's a long midrashic tradition about why Abraham. And in Maimonides, for example, it's not God who chooses Abraham, but Abraham who finds God. And I think it's more random than that. I mean, I used to joke that the reason he chose Avraham was because his name began with an A, and he was standing in the beginning, the front of the line. If his name had been Zachary, he never would have been chosen. He chooses this man, Abraham, and he makes a covenant, a deal. He says to Abraham, Lech lecha me'artzecha, I want you to leave home. I want you to leave behind the culture that has shaped you. I want you to leave behind the concept of the world that you've been raised with. I want you to leave behind the mythologies, the narratives that define you. And I want you to begin again. Go into the world, and what you do for me is Heyeh bracha, be a blessing. V'nivrechu b'cha kol mishpachot ha'adama, and in you shall all the peoples of the earth, all the families of humanity be blessed. And that's Abraham's job. Now, what's implicit in that is something quite remarkable. God needs him. God needs this human being. God needs this human being to be a vessel of blessing in the world. God needs this human being as a partner. But the question then is, well, what does that mean? God needs him. What does it mean to be a need of God? What does that mean to be a partner of God? And that's what the Torah portion is going to be arguing with. That's what it's wrestling with. And so we have the story where God announces that the evil of Sodom and Gomorrah is so great, I'm going to destroy it all. And then God ruminates this question: shall I tell Abraham what I'm going to do? Now, the ostensible answer to that question is, of course not. You're God. You can do whatever you want. You're not accountable to anyone. Me, I'm a married guy. So I carry a telephone wherever I am because I'm accountable to my wife, and I'm accountable to the community that has hired me, and I'm accountable to many, many people. And the telephone is the symbol of my accountability, as is my wedding ring and other things. Is God accountable to Abraham? Is it possible to conceive of God accountable to a human being? But if Abraham is to represent divine justice in the world, if Abraham is to be the vessel of blessing in the world, indeed, yes, God is accountable to Abraham. So the answer to the question is, shall I hide from Abraham what I'm going to do? You can't. You have to tell him, because he is your representative, your ambassador, the vessel of your presence, your blessing in the world. Now, once Abraham knows what God is going to do, the most remarkable sequence ensues. I mean, this is so remarkable to me. And it's one of the examples that if you didn't know this was in the Bible, you would not believe that someone had the chutzpah to write this story. Because what happens? God says, I'm going to wipe out Sodom and Gomorrah. Abraham says, you know what? You can't. God says, what do you mean I can't? I'm God. He says, you stand for justice, right? Well, justice would dictate that if there are 50 good people in the city, you can't wipe out the innocent along with the guilty. What kind of God would you be? That's not the world you wanted us to create. So if you find 50 in the city, you got to let them go. And God says, okay, I'll let them go if you find 50. Now, Abraham has sold enough rugs and camels in the shuk of Beersheba to know that once the customer steps in the store and you have a price, now we can do some business. He says, you said 50, didn't you? If I find 50, you'll save the city, right? 50, didn't you say 50? What if 5 are away? 45. For 50, you'd save it. For 5, you have to save it 45. God says 45. Abraham says 5 more. Can I get 40? I get 40. Abraham says, what about 30? Can I get 30? How about 20? Can I get 20? 10? Can you take 10? God says, okay, once.
Oh,
My soul to the God of the... It is an absurd story.
yes.
But now, what is the story saying? It is such a powerful story. Abraham is arguing justice with God, which means that God is bound by an external sense of justice. Remember, in Socrates, in Plato, and Rabbi Gellman is a wonderful philosopher. In Plato, there's this question: is it right because God said it was right? Or is it right? And did God say it was right because it's right? And that's what the Torah is playing with. Plus the idea of, now that you're a partner with God, a need of God, God needs you. What's the extent of that relationship? These are the two principal questions in this remarkable narrative of Sodom and Gomorrah. And if I'm getting excited, it's true, because this is my favorite story in the Torah. It's my favorite story because it's all about chutzpah. And chutzpah here doesn't mean just, temerity or, cheek. Chutzpah means standing up for what is right, no matter what the consequences are. It's a kind of moral courage. And the story here is Abraham stands in front of God. Look, because if God were not the God of the Bible, he'd smash him like a bug. What does he need the thesaurus for? What does he need the thesaurus for? How many of us have been questioned by our teenage children? And you want to say, like, because I'm your father, that's why. But you don't say that because you love your kid and you want your kid to be an independent moral force. God cherishes the moral chutzpah, the independent moral imagination of human beings. That's what this story is about. How do you read this story, Marc?
Just exactly like that. And it's interesting because there's this contrast. There's a symmetry. There's 10 generations from Adam to Noah, and another 10 generations from Noah to Abraham. And it's a complete downward spiral. And in the middle there with Noah, so if we ask the question, why did Abraham argue with God and Noah didn't? I mean, God is destroying the world, and there had to be innocent people in the world with Noah, and Noah just shuts up and builds the ark. And all of a sudden, Abraham argues with God. And I think the reason is that the God that Abraham knew was the God after the covenant with Noah, where God says, all right, I'm going to be bound by justice. I'm not going to destroy the world again by a flood. And Abraham knew that. Noah knew nothing. All he knew is that this is a power God who's going to destroy the whole world. And what am I? I'm nothing. So I'll build the ark and I'll save my tushy. But basically, he didn't know a God who had this external limitation of justice. Abraham can say, "Hashofet kol haaretz lo ya'aseh mishpat," shall not the judge of all the earth do justice, because he knew about that. All right. So that explains why Abraham can argue and not Noah.
But wait 1 second. What's that? So I want to add one tiny piece to that. That's the Great Revolution. The Great Revolution of Jewish theology isn't monotheism. Maybe it's not only monotheism, let's put it that way, but the idea that God stands for justice. That's a remarkable idea in the world. It's a remarkable idea today. It was a remarkable idea in a pagan world when gods had all sorts of agendas.
Yes.
And the idea that Hashofet kol haaretz, God stands for justice, remarkable idea. Go ahead, please.
It is. And what's remarkable is that the idea that God or gods, plural for polytheistic cultures, are powerful, that's nothing new. That's not a new idea. From the beginning of the idea of gods, all the way back 6,000 years ago in Hinduism, there's this idea that gods have power. What is remarkable, and you said it on the money, is that here's a God who is both powerful and true,
right,
who is connected to both power and truth. Now, truth is an independent standard, meaning it's an accessible standard to us through what eventually will be called in the late Middle Ages, natural law. That is, it's God's will to do this and this and this, but it's also rational to do this and this and this. So the idea was, which is the great contribution of medieval scholasticism, to try and reconcile a God of power and independent search for truth. All right? So we're all on board with that. And Abraham argues with God and everything is good. And it's interesting in terms of the justice, because this brings in the concept of mercy, that God is perfectly entitled to destroy all the cities, Sodom and Gomorrah, if there's less than 10 people and everyone in them. But that's not what God does. God doesn't destroy the cities with everyone in them, even though God's entitled to, by the deal of Abraham. He saves Lot's wife, and the kids, and they all get out of there. All right. This is not the problem that is bone-chilling. The bone-chilling problem, made worse actually by Abraham arguing with God.
Right.
Much worse, because it's the same guy, and all of a sudden, this guy who has this great courage to call God to account. The only other example of that in Jewish literature is, I think, the Din Torah Mitgod of Levi Yitzchak, which is one of the great operatic, I think Paul Robeson sang it. It made me cry the first time I heard it, where Levi Yitzchak is calling God to a Beit Din for all the deaths of Jews. No, the question is, why didn't Abraham argue with God about killing his son? Why did he just take it and do it and have the knife in his hand raised to strike down on his son until the angel from heaven said, Avraham, Avraham? And that's the great question. It exercised secular philosophers who were actually personally religious, like Soren Kierkegaard, He wrote Fear and Trembling, and his also companion work, The Sickness Unto Death. It's one of the most problematic stories, and for reasons that were never explained by the rabbis in any commentarial tradition I know of. It was chosen as the reading for Rosh Hashanah. Second day for traditional Jews, and Reform Jews put it on the first day. So here we have the story of an abomination. It isn't just God's asking someone to build an ark. All right, it's a lot of work, but okay, it doesn't hurt anyone. It's not like, well, God's going to destroy a foreign city filled with lousy people and you want to save. No, this is your son who is completely innocent. And God is asking you, this God of justice, Hashofet kol haaretz, what's the justice of killing an innocent boy who happens to be your son, who you love? No, no, no. And what's fascinating to me is how many Jews who are, this is what Hermann Gunkel once called the problem of reading the Torah, which he said, we read it with sacred inattention. Gunkel was a German Torah scholar. We read it with sacred inattention, meaning we have brains. We use our brains to figure out all sorts of stuff. And yet, here they read the story of the sacrifice of Isaac and say, okay, yeah, he wanted him to kill his son. Okay, what's next? What? If you believe in this, if you want to believe in this God, how can you believe that? How can you not throw up? This is way beyond child abuse. This is child murder.
Right.
So
let's sharpen the question. I want to sharpen the question, okay? If you look at the Abraham narratives from the very beginning, there are two lines of narrative that go contrapuntally back and forth. One is the line of Abraham and his relationship with God, and the other is the line of Abraham and his family. And the two narratives go back and forth, right? It begins with Lech lecha me'artzecha. I want you to leave home. So the narratives, what that says is the two narrative lines split. The man leaves his family, and now he's on his own, pursuing his religious vision. And then we come back to the story of Sarah being traded to the Pharaoh. And then we come back to the story of the covenant of the pieces. And then we come back to the story of the birth of Ishmael. And then we come back and forth. The story goes between Abraham as family man and Abraham as covenantal character. And they come together in this story again. The Akedah is where the two lines of story converge as they did at the beginning. If at the beginning is Lech lecha, leave home, and your family life and your religious life will parallel each other but won't touch, at the end, when God says, take your son, your only one, and offer him up to me, the two lines come together. Now, what makes it so powerful is that Abraham has been promised. The whole time, Abraham has been asking for one thing. God keeps offering him all these promises. Your descendants will be like the sands on the beach and the stars in the sky. Your descendants will inherit the world. Your descendants will be many nations. And what does Abraham keep saying? I just want one. I just want one kid. I just want somebody to carry on my name in the world. Just one. I don't want stars. I don't want sand. I want one kid. Finally, at the age of 100 and something, he gets a kid. His wife is 90 years old. And he
got a kid before.
Well, that's another. We'll come back to that. Miracle kid. And then what does God say? Kill the kid. And you understand what that means? That means that the promise that you'll have descendants, the promise that you'll carry on this tradition, the promise that you'll be immortal is destroyed in this story. It's not just that he's asked to kill his kid, which is a horrendous idea, but he's asked to destroy the one thing in the world that keeps God's promises alive, that substantiates the divine promise. So that this is a no pass test. This is a no win situation. If he kills the kid, he has no heir.
Well,
Promise is abrogated. If he doesn't kill the kid, he's disobeyed God. What is he supposed to do? One more piece of this. Many people read this. When I was a kid in Hebrew school, they said to us, this shows you God doesn't want human sacrifice. Too simple, too facile, too superficial. First of all, if that were really the story, it would say that. And instead, what it says is, because you were willing to do this, you're going to get all these blessings and rewards. On the contrary, it actually supports human sacrifice. It's a horrible idea. But the question is, how can God go to a man who has waited a lifetime for a child and say to him, I'm more important to you than your kid. I'm more important to you than your fatherly conscience, your fatherly emotion, your fatherly heart. It is a horrendous story. And because it occurs in the same Torah portion where the Sodom and Gomorrah story is, where Abraham was willing to fight for what was just and right. And here he's silent. He's silent. That is such a heartbreak. Now, I have an understanding of how to solve it. I don't think it's the only understanding. It's one. Rabbi Gellman has a wonderful way of reading it. So give us your reading of the story.
Well, so as you know, I write midrash. One of my goals in my rabbinic career was to revive midrash for children and for adults. And through my work at Moment Magazine, I was able, over 20 years, to publish a bunch of midrashim. Some were collected into books for children. Others were just left in Moment. Most of the adult stuff is there. And midrash was for me an obsession because it was a way of actually contributing to Jewish literature. There was nothing else I could contribute. I couldn't contribute halacha. First of all, even if I knew enough Gemara to offer laws, they wouldn't be followed because I'm a Reform rabbi. But every tradition has halacha and agadah, law and story. There's a great essay by Bialik that explains the nuances of that. You should all read that. Halacha v'agadah. And so I knew when I started this effort to revive midrash, it's sort of like baseball. When you're a player, you want to play in the major leagues. And I knew that if I was going to be serious about this, I had to do a midrash on the Akedah. I had to. But for years and years, I had no answer to it. And then one year, I'm reading it, and one phrase at the very beginning of the story in chapter 22, Vayehi achar hadvarim ha'ele, v'ha'elohim nisad Avraham. And I said, hey, whoa, time out. What other story do I know of in the Torah that begins reflexively, that begins with the statement, and it came to pass after these things? What were these devarim, these things that then caused the Akedah? And I said, well, why don't I just go back to 21? And there you see the expulsion of Hagar by Sarah, who now has a son, and she doesn't want Ishmael to inherit. It's a real medieval thing. The firstborn gets everything. And so here he is. She finally gets a kid, but he's the secondborn, so he's not getting anything. And so she gets all upset at Hagar and transfers it to Abraham and says, she's disrespecting me. Expel her, which when you're talking about sending a woman and a baby into the desert, it's a request to kill her. So I'm going to shorten the midrash, but you can read it and we send it to you if you want. But basically, this is the way it goes. Because God is connected to both power and truth, the representatives of God must also be connected to power and truth. And God is not going to give Abraham and his descendants power over the land. if they aren't also willing to live in truth, according to the moral law. And because Abraham has had ups and downs, God is not sure about the moral quality of Abraham. The business of foisting Sarah as his sister to the Pharaoh, not a good look, not a good look. And not trusting him and laughing and although Sarah's laughing. There's a whole bunch of things that Abram and then Abraham, he's not sure about. But as soon as he's willing to kill the woman he took into his tent as his amma, as his maidservant, his surrogate wife, and as soon as she gives birth, and Sarah, the beloved wife, wants them killed, even though at first she wanted him to do it, God says, wait a minute. I promised to Hagar that her son would be the father of a great nation. And if Abraham sends her into the desert, she'll die, and that'll be the end of that promise. The only way to test whether Abraham believed that God would protect Hagar and Ishmael and the promise is to test him on the other promise, which is the promise, Ki b'Yitzchak yikara lechazera, because through Isaac your seed will be known. I'll make Isaac a great nation too. Unless Abraham believes both things are true, God will protect Ishmael and Hagar, despite the fact they've been expelled, and God will protect Isaac. Unless Abraham believes both, he can't be the progenitor to the Jewish people. So there's only one way to do it. God didn't want to do it, but because Abraham vacillated about the request to kill Hagar and Ishmael, God had no choice. So God says, kill Isaac. And once he sees that Abraham believes against all evidence, because killing Isaac will kill the promise, like you said, and as long as he was willing to do it, it showed that he also believed in the other promise with Ishmael and Hagar. And so God passes him through the test, and Ishmael becomes the progenitor of the Arab peoples, and Isaac becomes the progenitor of the Jewish people, and Abraham passes the test. And so the message of the Akedah is that the willingness to sacrifice the least loved among us leads inevitably to the sacrifice of the best loved.
Mm.
And that is my midrash on the Akedah.
It's beautiful.
I'm proud of it.
No, it's a very beautiful midrash. I'll propose a slightly different, a very different notion, because a different, not a different midrash, but a different reading of the text. The question is, does the Bible give us a consistent text, or is the Bible a set of snapshots? And I'm going to suggest here that we have snapshots, and that what's being presented to us is a very stark choice, frankly, between two very different religious sensibilities. We call it the Sodom and Gomorrah sensibility and the Akedah sensibility. Akedah is the sacrifice of Isaac sensibility. And what they're two very different kinds of religious personalities that grow from these. Rabbi Showeiss, who's my teacher, used to say that the way that you read the Akedah is the most powerful indication of what kind of religious personality you are. So what we have here is two very interesting religious personalities that carry two very different sets of values. The value in the Sodom and Gomorrah story is chutzpah, that one must fight for one's moral vision, that moral imagination is supported, that God welcomes moral protest, that God welcomes moral imagination, and that the heart of religion is the cultivation of conscience. And the Sodom and Gomorrah story, the Akedah story, talks about obedience, about subservience, about submitting your will to the Creator. This is certainly how Kierkegaard read it. I mean, Kierkegaard said, if you don't believe that he is a knight of faith, suspending the ethical in the name of his religious vision, then he's nothing more than ordinary garden variety child murderer. And I think there's a certain validity to that. Now, what you can do, what the tradition did, and what modern scholars have done, depending on which one you are, which story that you adopt as the normative story, is you tend to read the other story in the light of that one. So just to give an example. So Kierkegaard, great Danish philosopher of the 19th century, adopts the Akedah story as his fundamental model of what religious life is like. That at some point, religion, faith, God, calls upon you to sacrifice everything, including your conscience, to obey even if it seems wrong to you. And that's what you give up most. You not only give up your aesthetic, your bodily joys in the world, you give up your own morality to a God who says, follow me. And that's what makes Abraham, for Kierkegaard, such a remarkable model of faith. And in the Jewish world, Kierkegaard is followed by, well, I'll give you two names. One is Yeshaya Leibovich, who said, you don't ask why I do a mitzvah. God said, do it, you do it. You do it because that's what it means to be commanded. That if the mitzvah gives you anything else, joy, happiness, morality, in some ways it spoils the mitzvah because you're not doing the mitzvah to show your loyalty to God. You're doing it because you happen to enjoy eating challah Friday night or whatever reason you're doing the mitzvah. It has to be out of pure obedience. And Rav Soloveitchik, the great leader of American Orthodox, world Orthodoxy, in many ways followed the same kind of thing. You sacrifice yourself. My teacher, Rabbi Showeiss, liked the other story, as did my other teacher, David Hartman. For both of them, the idea of conscience, the idea of the chutzpahdik self, right? That's a different model of religious life, and they embrace that one as normative. And what you're able to do if you do that one as normative is you go back and read the Akedah. What Rabbi Showeiss asked this question, very interesting question. The question he asked, when Abraham hears a voice from heaven saying, Abraham, Abraham, don't touch the boy, whose voice is he hearing? How does he know it's God? Is it an angel? How does he know? For Showeiss, it's his own voice. It's the voice of conscience reasserting itself at the end of the story. For others, for more feminist philosophers, that's the voice of his wife, Sarah, saying, come home, back to family, back to domesticity. That's a reassertion of parts of himself which have been given up and now reclaimed in the religious encounter. I think that what we have here is a pretty stark choice that the Torah wants us to look at between two different models of religious life, and the implications that flow from them are quite remarkable. Although I love your midrash, Marc.
Well, I love yours too. And as they say in Meshivin al Hadarush, we don't debate midrash, we debate halacha, because you have to find one halacha that works, and that's the one, but not with midrash. So I accept and treasure your midrash as well. The problem I have in understanding your midrash is that obedience to an immoral command is not an obedience. Obedience, it's abomination, actually. So if God says, you know, the red heifer, and you don't need to know why, and no one knows why, you have to do the mitzvah of the red heifer, which is incomprehensible. Fine, you do it. Or, you know, why not mix milk and meat? You do it. But these are not morally conflicting acts of obedience. Mm. To be an obedient servant of God by being willing to kill your son is an abomination. Mm-hmm. So it doesn't show that you're obedient. It shows that you're immoral. So I like the idea that there's two personalities here. I don't think it works, because the second personality is being obedient to an immoral command.
But you're reading it because you're a Sodom and Gomorrah Jew. What did the Jewish tradition?
No, it isn't.
It is. The Jewish tradition.
I believe the Torah would not put this story in.
Yeah. Okay.
If it was immoral, I believe, and you have to. What I do believe is that you have a choice, And when I wrote the Midrash, I knew I had a choice. I could save God in the story of the Akedah,
Right.
what I did, or I could save Abraham, which I couldn't do. I mean, Abraham understood finally why he was being tested, because he had been willing to kill his other wife and his son. But he, that is the reason that the story is there. And that's why it says, Vayehi achar hadvarim. And there's other clues, like Yitzchak is also, Ishmael is called, he's a mitzachek. He's plays around.
So that's in there also, right?
They're the same guy. They're the same word. And then the Avraham, the command at the end, Avraham.
Yeah.
One is the Avraham who's the father of Isaac, and the other is the Avraham who's the father of Ishmael.
See, I'm reading this story as Kierkegaard read it, about a teleological suspension of the ethical.
The most bold.
Well, that's why I think that it is an immoral story, but it's there anyway, because the idea is you're willing to sacrifice your morality. Yeah, and I think that it bothered the rabbis, it bothered the tradition. That's why all the midrash are there. There's a great deal of midrash that says Abraham began to argue with God. It just squeezed in between the lines.
Yeah, it's true, but here's the problem.
Yeah.
Why go with what Kierkegaard called the teleological suspension of the ethical?
Right.
Why go with, I'm willing to do an immoral thing to show my faith? Because my faith in God is higher than my belief in morality. Okay. Why go there if you don't have to? Why go there if you don't have to? And in my midrash, you don't have to. It's God needed to find out if Abraham believed in both promises. And he had to test him on that basis.
Right. Well, again, I think that's because you're ultimately a Sodom and Gomorrah Jew.
Yeah.
You're reading the story that way. Because you can read it the other way. And, Leibovich doesn't bother Leibovich, doesn't bother Soloveitchik. They relish in the fact that he's willing to do it. And if you read it, like, for example, that it's, you read some of the Midrashim, that he was passionate about doing this. And you say, like, what? It's a very hard story. Anyway, let's stop here, because I think we've opened up the story in a wonderful, wonderful way. And I want to thank everyone for listening today, because this is a very challenging Torah portion and a very fascinating Torah portion. So sit down tonight and read it with your family, because it's a wonderful story. Don't read it with your kids. You'll scare the hell out of them.
No.
Right? But take a look. It's a marvelous, marvelous story. And if it bothers you, you're on the right track. If it doesn't bother you, then you got tzoros. But if it bothers you, Thank you, Marc. Thanks for joining me today.
Good job, Eddie.
Following this, of course, the Shabbat this morning, a very good treat. The Neshama Minyan, direct from Valley Beth Shalom, Nina's Minyan, my wife, Rabbi Nina Bieber Feinstein, leading a beautiful, beautiful musical minyan. So please join us following the service, this Torah study on VBS, on YouTube or Facebook to watch Nina's service. Of course, every evening at 6, every morning at 7:30, except Sunday morning at 8:30. And we wish you a very, very wonderful Shabbat. Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbat Shalom.